guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and happy holidays and happy Christmas to you guys. And yeah, it was Christmas yesterday and I got a lot of presents, and I hope you got a lot of presents, guys. And today is the best day, guys, to have, it's Christmas, but it's Christmas, guys, and no, it's not Christmas. It's the day after Christmas, guys. The 26th. This 26th. I can't pronounce. I can't say the 20. Yeah, I can't say it right now. So, guys, yeah, it's the 20. Yeah, you know, it's the day after Christmas, guys, and a special video for you. You thought I would not read today, but I will, because you guys are my YouTube family, and YouTube is such a good thing. So, yeah, let's get started with Chapter 7 of The Puppy Place, the special edition Fluffy and Freckles by Ellen Miles. Chapter 7. Charles spent the whole rest of the afternoon in the cabin. The winds howled and the snow swirled. Outside, the winds howled and the snow swirled outside, but inside it was warm and cozy. Charles was happy to take care of Fluffy while Dad and Steve finished boiling up the sap in the tank. Freckles mostly stayed outside with them, though he barked at the door now and then to see if Fluffy was ready to play. It turned out that Steve had been right about Fluffy being fine once he'd have some formula. The lamb stopped trembling and bleeding, and by the time he finished the first bottle, he was ready to get down off Charles' lap and explored the cabin. He was so cute as he scampered around on his tiny hooves. He checked everything out, from the plants on the windowsill to the stacks of the CDs. By the bookcase, his tail wagged just like a dog's as he pawed at things that interested him, and his little ears moved around like radar antennae. And boy, could he jump. The first time Charles saw Fluffy leap onto the couch, he was shocked. It was like the lamb had little springs in his feet, and he loved to bounce around once. And Charles, wait, guys. And Charles, let me just start over. He was so cute. He scampered around on his tiny hooves. He checked everything out, from the plants on the windowsills to the stack of CDs by the bookcase. His tail wagged just like a dog's as he pawed at things that interested him and his boy. And his little ears moved around the radar antenna, and boy, could he jump. The first time Charles saw Fluffy leap onto the couch, he was shocked. It was like the lamb had little springs in his feet, and he loved to bounce around. Once, when Charles was down on all fours trying to play with him, Fluffy even bounced right onto Charles' back. When the lamb began bleeding again, Charles knew exactly what to do. "Food is coming," he told Fluffy. "Hold on just a sec." Steve had showed him how to mix the formula. Charles quickly made up a bottle, then took it over to the couch and held it while Fluffy sucked hungrily on the nipple. Charles loved holding Fluffy while he ate. The lamb's curly coat was so springy and soft, and it was so entertaining to watch his little nose wriggle and his little ears swivel the way and that. This time, when he finished eating, Fluffy curled up on Charles' lap and went right to sleep. Nap time for little lambs, Charles whispered as he stroked the lamb's soft coat. That's right, you need your rest. Fluffy sighed and nestled in more comfortably. Charles kissed the top of his head. Fluffy smelled so good, kind of woolly actually, and liked Charles' favorite red sweater. A few minutes later, Charles' stomach began to growl. He'd been so busy feeding Fluffy that he'd forgotten to feed himself. But now he was stuck sitting there on the couch until the lamb woke up. Charles tried to ignore his grumbling tummy, but all he could think about was the giant sandwich he was going to make as soon as he could. Finally, Fluffy woke up. He blinked at Charles, then gave himself a little shake and leapt down on the floor to continue his explorations. Charles jumped up too and headed straight for the kitchen if he was hungry, and Dad and Steve must be too. He made 3 big sandwiches and gobbled down half of his own while he made another bottle of formula. He knew that Fluffy was probably going to start bleeding any minute, so he might as well be ready. Sure enough, Charles was barely finished getting the formula mix before Fluffy began to bleed again. Sighing, Charles grabbed one more bite of the sandwich and then brought the bottle over to the couch. The lamb jumped right up, and began to drink as if he was starving this time. When Fluffy finished the bottle, Charles settled the lamb between some pillows on the couch. He loved having Fluffy sleep on his lap, but he didn't want to get trapped again. I've got to bring lunch out to Dad and Steve, he said to Fluffy. You be good, Lamby, and have a nice nap. I'll be right back. Charles put the sandwiches on a plate and pulled on his boots. When he pushed the back door open, he gasped. Swirling snow surrounded him, the wind pushing flakes into his eyes, his nose, his mouth. Wow, he said. He could hardly even make a sugary shack through the curtain of white. Then he saw something moving, brown spots again, the white. Freckles, he said. The puppy bounded happily through the snow toward him, ears flapping. He didn't seem at all fazed by the blizzard. Freckles sniffed at the plate in Charles' hand. He gave Charles a sideways look and grinned, wagging his tail hopefully. Maybe you've got some treats for me there. Charles smiled and shook his head at the little brown pup. Freckles already seemed completely at home here. It was too bad that Steve didn't want any pets. This is for the people, Freckles, he said. But if you want to come inside with me after I deliver it, I'll give you some kibble. Charles knew Freckles wouldn't understand everything he was saying, but it didn't matter. Dogs liked it when you talked to them and explained things. Charles pushed on, stomping through the snow toward the sugar shack. The sap was boiling hard, and Charles could smell the sweet scent of almost syrup. Hooray, said Steve when he saw Charles coming. He was chomping wood, but he put down his hatchet and came over to take a sandwich. He brushed the snow off his jacket and smiled at Charles. Our hero, I'm starving. So am I, Dad said. He stroked the fire one more time, throwing chunks of wood into the roaring blaze beneath the boiling sap. Then he stood up and helped himself, taking half of a sandwich in each hand. Thanks a lot, Charles. He took a big bite of one in his hand. Yum, you're getting good at this. Maybe I'll start asking you to make my lunches when we're home. Charles ducked his head. He liked making Dad happy. We've already made 3 gallons of syrup, Steve reported. Just a bit more to boil off, and we'll be done for the day. How's the lamb doing? Dad asked. I mean, Fluffy. He's great. He's already had 3 bottles, said Charles. Nice work, said Steve. I knew you'd be good at this. Charles ducked his head again. He's probably hungry again by now, he said. I better get back in there. He was beginning to realize that a big responsibility it was to take care of a baby lamb. No wonder Steve had been happy for the help. Charles hurried through the snow and let himself back into the cabin. It was a relief to shut the door and leave the wind outside. It was quiet in the cabin, very quiet. Charles didn't hear any bleating. That was good. Maybe Fluffy was still napping. But where was he? The lamb was not on the couch where Charles had last seen him. Where are you? He called, looking all around for Fluffy. There. Then he spotted the little lamb curled up on the beds of towels near the wood stove, with Freckles right next to him. Oh no, Charles said. Steve had told him to keep the animals apart. How could this have happened? Had the wind pushed the door open? Maybe Charles hadn't latched it all the way when he went out. He rushed over, ready to pull Freckles away, but as he got closer, he saw that there was no need to worry. The lamb and the puppy both looked perfectly happy, curled up together. It was obvious that Freckles wasn't going to hurt Fluffy. The lamb's eyes were almost closed, and he had that funny smiling expression on his face. Freckles was relaxed, laying with one paw over his new friend's shoulder. The pup looked at Charles and thumped his tail. I found myself a buddy. Isn't he the best? Charles smiled at Freckles and bent to pet him. Good boy, he said. That's a good, gentle boy. At that, Fluffy leapt to his feet and began bleating. Charles burst out laughing. Yes, Fluffy, you're a good boy, too. But you're a lamb, not a puppy, remember? Fluffy bleated and pranced, springing around the room. Freckles scrambled after him, and the 2 animals had a quick game of chase. First, Fluffy chased Freckles, then Freckles chased Fluffy, and until Fluffy won the game by jumping onto the back of the couch, and from there to the top of a low bookshelf. Freckles stared up at his new friend, panting. He went into a playbow, front paws outstretched and hinds end in the air. Come on down from there and chase me some more. But Fluffy suddenly seemed to remember that he was hungry. He began to bleat again, and didn't stop until Charles fixed him a bottle and brought it over to the couch. Fluffy leapt from the bookshelf down onto the couch and then onto Charles' lap. He began to drink hungrily, while Freckles lay down to watch. Soon after the bottle was empty, Fluffy fell fast asleep on Charles' lap. Freckles snoozed too at Charles' feet. Woo! Whispered Charles to himself, leaning back on the couch. It was a lot of work taking care of these animals. He was ready for a rest himself. Chapter 8. Charles didn't mean to fall asleep, but the next thing he knew, Freckles was chasing Fluffy around the cabin again. "What is going on in here?" said Dad. Who must have just come in?" He stood by the front door, pulling off his jacket and boots. "Freckles, stop! Stop that! You're scaring the lamb." Charles laughed. "Fluffy isn't scared of anything," he said. "They're playing. Just watch for another minute, and you'll see." Sure enough, a moment later, the two reversed directions, and Fluffy began chasing Freckles. The puppy scrambled here and there, sliding on the wooden floor, while the lamb bounced after him. Dad started to laugh. "Just like a pair of puppies," he said. "I guess lambs are playful too." "Oh, sure," said Steve, who had come in behind Dad, stomping off his snow boots. "I love to watch them over at Cole's when they're first let out to pasture. The lambs all over the place, climbing on everything, including their mothers. They chase each other like that." "I thought we were supposed to keep them apart," said Charles. He'd been feeling terrible about maybe leaving the door open so Freckles would slip in. "Well, we did our best, and then I guess they 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 well, we did our best, and then I guess they took over. If they want to be friends, who are we to stop them?" Steve said nothing ever seemed to upset him. "Now, are you ready to help me get supper?" Charles jumped up. "Sure," he said. His only regular chores at home were setting the table and clearing the table. He and Lizzie traded days on that. He didn't usually help to make dinner, but why not? If Steve thought he could, Charles was just a kid. Charles was ready to give it a try. At home, Charles was just a kid. Here at Steve's, he felt like one of the guys. "Wash your hands," said Steve. "Then maybe the first thing you should do is get another bottle of formula mixed up. Seems like the lamb gets hungry every couple of hours or so. He might as well be ready." Steve was right no sooner, and Charles finished getting the bottle ready. And then Fluffy started to bleat. "I'll feed him this time," said Dad. He sat down on the couch, and Fluffy leaped right onto his lap. "Whoa!" Dad looked surprised. Then he gave Fluffy a hug. "This guy learns fast, didn't he?" Charles gave Dad the bottle, and Fluffy began to drink. "That's right, fella," said Dad. "Drink up." Charles watched, smiling. Dad had the same happy dream look on his face that he got when he was holding a human baby. Dad loved babies. Charles went back into the kitchen, and Steve put him into work peeling potatoes. "The peeler's sharp," he said, "so watch your fingers." At home, Mom didn't usually let Charles use sharp knives or peelers on his own. Charles picked up the peeler and swiped it along the potato, the way Steve had shown him, being careful to keep his fingertips out of the way. It wasn't hard at all. Now he sliced them really nice and thin, said Steve. He demonstrated for Charles, then handed him a long knife. Charles glanced at Dad, but Dad was still staring down at Fluffy. With that goofy look on his face, he shrugged and began to slice. Before long, he sliced up 8 potatoes. Nicely done, said Steve, who was busy mixing up meatloaf. Now he laid them in his baking dish, one partly on top of the next, so they looked kind of like fish scales. Charles was getting the hang of this cooking thing. It was easy and a lot of fun. He laid out the potatoes and added salt, pepper, butter, and milk, the way Steve told him to. Then they popped the pan into the oven that Steve had preheated. That's it, said Steve, giving Charles a high five. You just made a scalloped potatoes the way my grandma taught me when I was your age. Charles grinned. He looked over at Dad and saw that his father was snoring, with his head drooping over the sleeping lamb nestled on his lap. Freckles lay at Dad's feet, also sneezing. Charles put his hand over his mouth to quiet his laughter, then tugged on Steve's sleeve and pointed. The best part about helping to make dinner was sitting down to eat it. It was just about the most delicious dinner Charles had ever had, and Dad couldn't stop talking about how great the scalloped potatoes were. Charles didn't even mind helping to clean up afterward. Everything seemed like fun here at Steve's cabin. He was secretly glad that the downstairs had come. This was so much cozier than another night at the inn. After they cleaned up, Steve suggested they take Freckles out for a walk before bedtime. Wouldn't want the puppy to wander off in the storm, he said as he snapped on a leash. Fluffy woke up and wanted to come along, but Dad held on to the lamb as Steve and Charles stepped outside. Wow, said Charles when he saw how deep the snow already was. It came up under his boots, and as soon as he stepped out on the mudroom. I know, said Steve, and it's still coming down hard. I think we might be caring for Fluffy for longer than we thought. I doubt anybody's going anywhere tomorrow. Freckles plunged into the snow, even with the flashlight beam on him. He almost disappeared into the whiteness, except for his brown freckles and his one brown ear. He bounded and leaped, pushing his way through the drifts, as Steve and Charles tried to follow the snowshoe trail. Good enough, said Steve after Freckles had done his business. Let's head back. The cabin felt warmer and cozier than ever when they came back in a brushing snow off their jackets. The yellow glow of the kerosene lamps made everyone look pretty. Fluffy missed you, Dad said. The lamb leaped off his lap when he stopped Freckles, and the two began to play again. This time they both seemed tired out after a few laps around the room, Charles gave Fluffy one more bottle before bedtime and helped Dad change his diaper. Then he got the bed of towels near the wood stove, all ready for Fluffy and Freckles. Charles was sleeping on the floor right next to them on an old camping mat of Steve's. Dad was going to sleep on the couch. Charles sat down on the floor by the wood stove to give Fluffy one more hug before he tucked the lamp in. The lamb was so soft and warm, and he smelled so good. He nuzzled Charles' cheek and bleated softly into his ear. "I love you too, Fluffy," Charles said, holding him close. Then he felt something nudging his elbow. It was Freckles, pushing his nose against Charles' arm. "What about me? Don't I get a hug?" Charles smiled. He had been as patient as he could be, and now Freckles had finally ready for a hug. He settled Fluffy onto his bed of towels and pulled Freckles gently onto his lap. The white pup was warm and relaxed, and he let Charles hold him close without squirming or pulling away. Charles felt tears welling up in his eyes as he kissed the top of the puppy's sweet-smelling head. Lambs were wondering, but there was nothing like hugging a puppy. We can all take turns feeding Fluffy when he wakes up hungry in the night," said Steve as he turns off the lamps and climbs up the ladder to his sleeping loft. "I'll make a few bottles so they're ready." Charles slid down into the warm sleeping bag a little later on, feeling happy to lie down and stretch out. It had been a long, exciting day. He couldn't wait to see how much more snow fell overnight. Maybe Steve had a sled he could borrow to use on that hill beyond the last row of maples. Drowsily, Charles glanced over at Freckles and Fluffy, who lay curled up together nearby. They looked so cozy in the flickering light from the wood stove glass window. Charles yawned and slipped off into a deep sleep. It seemed like only minutes before Fluffy began to bleat again. Charles rolled over in his sleeping bag, groaning. How could one little lamb eat so much? "I've got it," Steve said. Charles heard him climbing down the ladder from his sleeping loft. Soon Fluffy's bleating stopped as he gulped down the bottle Steve fed him. Charles watched them for a while by the light of the wood stove, then drifted off to sleep again. When he woke up, there was a milky white light coming from the windows. Charles rubbed his eyes. He had slept through the whole night. Dad was still snoring on the couch, and Steve was up in his loft. Why hadn't any of them heard Fluffy bleating for food again? Charles sat up straight and looked over at the little bed near the stove. It was empty. "Dad," he called, jumping to his feet. "Steve, wake up. Fluffy and Freckles are missing." Chapter 9. Chapter 9. Steve scrambled down the ladder. Dad leapt off the couch. What? Where? Dad said, rubbing his eyes. How? Steve was already pulling his boots and jacket on. I woke up in the middle of the night and went out to check up on the snow. Maybe they slipped behind me. Charles slid out of the sleeping bag and ran for his own jacket and boots. A moment later, he and Dad and Steve were all outside, yelling for Freckles and Steve and Fluffy. The snow was still coming down, swirling out of the dim early morning sky. Charles followed Steve from the back door to the sugaring shed. The heavy, wet snow came up above his knees. It was the I'm just gonna start over. Steve scrambled down the ladder. Dad leapt off the couch. What? Where? Dad said, rubbing his eyes. How? Steve was already pulling his boots and jacket on. I woke up in the middle of the night and went out to check on the snow. Maybe they slipped out behind me. Charles slipped out of his sleeping bag and ran for his own jacket and boots. A moment later, Dad and Steve were all outside yelling for Fluffy and Freckles. The snow was still coming down, swirling out of the dim early morning sky. Charles followed of the dim early morning sky, and Charles followed Steve from the back door to the sugaring shed. The heavy wet snow came up above his knees. It was wait guys. It was tough going slogging through the drifts. Where'd they go? Steve asked, waving his arms. His face was red and his eyes were wide. We'll find them, Charles said. We have to find them. He had never seen Steve look upset before. He pictured the little puppy and the soft baby lamb floundering through the snow, and his heart sank. This was exactly the kind of thing Dad had meant about why Steve didn't want pets. Too much responsibility. They're not around back, Dad said, coming from the other side of the cabin. I didn't see any tracks at all. Okay, said Steve. He took a few deep breaths as if to calm himself. He'll have to search farther from the house. We'll need snowshoes. He headed for the cabin and stopped short when my door opens. Okay. He came closer to the door. Oh no, he said, stooping over to look more closely. The poor little guy. What is it? Charles asked. He and his dad joined Steve by the door. Someone tried to get our attention, Steve said, pointing to the bottom of the door. At one corner, the blue paint was scratched all the way down to the bare wood. Charles felt his heart skip a beat. That must have been Freckles scratching to be let in. he said. Exactly, said Steve. They got out, but then they couldn't get back inside. And I bet Fluffy was bleeding too, said Dad. How could we have slept through that? Steve grunted and stood up. We were really tired, he said, and stood up. We were really tired, he said, and the sound of the wind must have been louder. Anyway, we didn't hear them. Now we have to find them. He grabbed snowshoes from their hooks inside the mudroom and handed them around. But how do we know where to look? There aren't any tracks to follow, Dad said. The storm wiped out, and we wiped them out, said Charles, suddenly realizing what had happened. We can't see any tracks right around here because he ran around and messed everything up. Maybe if we just go a little bit farther, we'll see something. Just what I was thinking, said Steve as he buckled on his snowshoes. Let's go. He plunged off into the snow. A moment later, Dad and Charles followed. It was not easy sludging in through the deep snow. Charles' snowshoes punched through the heavy, wet drifts. No matter how careful he tried to walk, he felt like he was tripping over his own feet. He had to lift his knees for each step, as if he was marching off the snow, melting around the tops of his boots, and his wet socks squelched as he walked. It was exhausting. Take an easy sport, said Dad from behind him. From behind him. Dad was breathing hard too. Don't try to rush, that only makes it harder. But Charles felt like he had to rush. If he felt cold and wet and don't try to rush, that only makes it harder. But Charles felt like he had to rush. If he felt cold and wet and tired and frustrated, think how those two baby animals must feel out there on their own. I think I see tracks, Steve shouted. Charles saw him stoop over, then kneel down on the snow. Yes! Charles and Dad caught up to him, and Steve showed them the indentions in the snow. They're blurry because the snow is still falling, but I'm almost sure these are recent. I don't get it, Dad said. Why would they wander even farther away from the house? I mean, here they are, out in the howling snowstorm. Wouldn't you think they would try to find shelter? Charles stared at Dad. That's it, he said. Steve looked confused for a moment. Then his face lit up. He nodded at Charles. You're right, he stood up. Let's go. Dad didn't get it yet. Go where? He asked to Charles. It was so obvious. If the animals needed shelter, Freckles knew where to find it. That's where he have gone. That's where he have taken his friend to the cave, to the place where he first found Freckles, Charles said, following Steve up the trail. Sure enough, the blurry tracks turned off the main trail toward the pine forest, just as they had on the first day. Steve was charging through the snow now, and Charles had Dad struggle to keep up. The snow wasn't as deep once they were in the woods, where the log boughs at the pine trees had caught the falling flakes. As Steve pushed through the drifts of snow fell from the branches, slipping down Charles' neck and making him shiver. He didn't hear. Then they were getting closer. "Freckles," he called. We're coming." When they entered the small clearing near the rocky ledge, Charles tried to dash ahead. He couldn't wait to see Freckles' face sticking out from the little cave opening. "Wait," said Steve, grabbing Charles' jacket. "Don't scare them." Charles slowed down. He knew Steve was right, even though Freckles and Fluffy had gotten used to people and even liked being around them. They were probably very frightened right now. Dad came up behind them, and Charles put a finger to his lips. Dad nodded. All three of them crept quietly forward until they were close to the rocky ledge. Charles held his breath. 3. There, in the dark little cave opening. Charles saw a flash of white as a spot of brown, then motioned for them to stop. He knelt down, and so did Charles and Dad. "Hey, friends," Steve said softly. "It's us. We're here to help." Charles saw Freckles poke out his whole head out of the cave, and just behind him he saw Fluffy's adorable face with its sticking out ears. "It's okay," he whispered. "Don't be scared." That was when Fluffy pushed right past Freckles and bounded into the clearing, bleeding happily, or maybe hungrily, or probably both. Charles picked up the lamb and held him close. "There you are," he said. "You're safe with us." Now Freckles ran out too, straight for Steve. "I thought you'd never find us!" Steve laughed as he scooped up the little dog into his arms and hugged him. You rascal," he said, running off like that. You had us worried." "But he was so smart to come here," said Charles. "He knew just what to do to take care of himself and his friends." "Let's get both of these friends home," said Dad. "I bet they're hungry and cold and tired." He helped Charles zip Fluffy inside his jacket, where the lamb would be cozy, and then all three of them trudged back to the cabin, carrying their precious cargo. When they got inside, Charles rubbed Fluffy down with one of his towels, while Steve dried Freckles. Dad brought over a bottle, and Charles sat right down on the wood stove to feed the bleeding lamb. "That's right," he said as Fluffy sucked at the bottle. "You're safe now." Freckles curled up next to them, gazing lovingly at his woolly friends. Steve got up to pour out some kibble for Freckles. "Come on, pup," he called. "You must be hungry too." Freckles glanced over at the dish and thumped his tail, but he didn't budge. "I'm good for now." just want to make sure my friend is okay. Charles felt the lamb relax in his arms. The bottle was nearly empty, and Fluffy's eyelids were drooping. So soon it would be nap time again. Charles sighed and let himself relax too. He was so glad that both animals were safe and sound. In the cabin, like, look, like Steve. He pointed out the window, and Charles saw a patch of blue. The snow was finally stopped. The wind has died down too. I think the sun might even come out. He grinned at Dad and Charles. You know what that means. The trees will start running again. More sap to gather. More sap to gather. Chapter 10. Woo! Guys, I'm gonna get some water. Okay. Chapter 10. The rest of the day passed much like the day before. Steve and Dad gathered sap and boiled it, while Charles looked after the animals. He made sandwiches again at lunchtime and brought them out to the sugar shed. By late afternoon, it was obvious that Charles and Dad would be spending one more night at the cabin, and Steve really needed their help. Steve really needed their help. The next morning, Charles was giving Fluffy a bottle. He heard a groan from the kitchen. Oh no, said Steve. He smacked his head. I don't believe it. What happened? Said Charles. Charles said. I just checked the calendar. That's what, said Steve. We've been so busy, I've spaced it out. But this is Maple Open House weekend. That means the day of the Spring Fling Wing Day. Charles remembered that Spring Fling was annual party Dad had told him about on the way up. What's Maple Open House weekend? What's Maple Open House weekend? He asked. Sugar houses all over the state invite visitors to stop by one weekend in March. Steve said, I just like to add to the fun by having a big party for my friends as well. Will people still come even with all the snow? Dad asked Steve. Steve laughed. By this time of year, Vermonters have what it's called cabin fever from being stuck inside all winter. Everybody's happy to get out and do something different. They'll be here. We pulled the fridge open. I'm going to have to go shopping, he said, looking inside. There's barely enough food left for us, much less 20 other people. Doesn't everybody bring food to the party, Dad asked. Steve nodded. Sure, but I like to have plenty on hand too. I was still hoping you'd make your famous firehouse chili. I really bought the ingredients for that. Perfect, said Dad. And now that Charles is becoming a great chef, he can help me cook while you're shopping. We can tidy up the place too. Really? Steve asked, looking relieved. That would be excellent. As far as gathering sap and boiling, we can do that when everyone's here. People love to help out. It's part of the fun. The rest of the morning went by in a blur. Charles helped Dad chop onions, open cans of beans, and add spices. He put away the sleeping bag and the blankets and Dad had been using, and shook out the towels, and Fluffy and Freckles had been sleeping on in between. He gave Fluffy a bottle every time he began to bleat, and took Freckles outside when he asked to be let out, changed the lamb's diaper, and tried to keep Fluffy from jumping onto the furniture he just dusted. By the time Steve came back, the cabin was tidy and a big pot of chili was bubbling away. That it smells fantastic here, said Steve, as he sets bags of groceries on the counter. And it looks terrific too. I can't thank you two enough. People started arriving at lunchtime, and Charles stayed busy passing out bowls of chili. Charles stayed busy and helping to set out the rest of the food, and the food the guest had bought Fluffy and Freckles bought wait and helping to set out the rest of the food the guest had bought. Fluffy and Freckles greeted each guest happily, bouncing around like pinballs in a machine as the afternoon went on and it began to warm up outside. The party moved to the sugar shack, where Steve had started to boil sap. The food was spread out on a picnic table, and people all ages stood around to watch the sap boil while they caught up after the long winter. A couple of other dogs had arrived too, and Charles was happy to see that Freckles gave each one of them a friendly greeting. Cole arrived, and Charles took her inside to see Fluffy. "Wow, you've been doing a great job with this one," she said. "He's really thriving," Charles smiled. "He's a good eater," he told her. We're already almost out of formula." "No problem," said Cole. "My last Ewe had her lamb yesterday. All the babies are doing well. I'll be able to bring him home with me today. Now that I can take care of him, he needs to be back with the flock anyway. It's time. He remembered that he's actually a sheep, not a puppy." Charles gulped. He'd known all along that Fluffy would be going back to the farm, but still, he was going to miss the little lamb and Freckles. Was going to miss his friends even more. But Cole was right. Fluffy belonged with the other sheep. "Speaking of puppies," said Charles, as he ladled out a bowl of chili for Cole, "we're looking for a home for Freckles. He's really smart and great with lambs. Maybe you could use him on the farm." Charles had decided that Cole's farm would be a perfect home for Freckles, and he'd been planning his speech all morning. That way he'd had Fluffy would always be together. He finished. Cole ruffled Freckles' ears. "Oh, I really wish I could. He's a real cutie, and he'd be welcome to visit with us any time. But I already have Sky and Galena, my two sheep dogs. Between them, and the sheep, and the goats, and the geese, and the ducks, and the chickens, and my milk cows, I think my farm is already about filled up." I didn't know you had all those animals," said Charles. "I only saw the sheep the day we came to get Fluffy." "Come visit before you leave," Cole said. You can meet them all. Meanwhile, maybe Adelaide would be interested in the pup. After all, she fed him all winter while he lived in her barn. She had Charles walked all outside, and Cole pointed out a pretty white-haired woman with glasses. Charles took a plate of cheese and crackers and started to walk over, offering it to people. When we got to Adelaide, he smiled up at her. What do you think of Freckles? He asked. I think I he asked. I know. He was staying in your barn for a while. He looks good, doesn't he? Is that what you named the pup? She asked, taking a cracker. Great name. I love it. And yes, he looks great. Steve told me you've been taking really good care of him. I couldn't even get close to him when he was staying in my barn. He was too shy. He's not so shy anymore, said Charles. Freckles even likes hugs and belly rubs now. Steve, sweet, said Adelaide. I'd love to pet him, but I'm allergic that I'd be sneezing for the rest of the day. Charles sighed. He had just been about to ask Adelaide if she wanted to adopt Freckles, but now there was no point. Freckles really needs a home. But Charles, what about Steve? Asked Adelaide. Steve, Charles was surprised. I thought he didn't want any pets. Adelaide laughed. Oh no, you're absolutely right about that. I can't imagine Steve with a dog. A very independent cat might, but a very independent cat maybe, but never a dog. No, I meant to this other Steve, dancing Steve, that one. She pointed to a man with a big bushy beard and a mustache. Dancing Steve, Charles asked. Adelaide laughed again. That's what we call him. That's what we call him. He loves to go dancing, and he does it whenever he can. Okay, Charles shrugged. So maybe dancing Steve wants a dog. He went up to pick up a platter of deviled eggs to carry over the crowd, weaving his way and that until he was standing right to the man with the beard. You must be Paul's son, said Dancing Steve, sticking out a hand for a shake. I hear you did a great job taking care of Cole's lamb. Thanks, said Charles. Ed? He asked. He held up the platter, and Dancing Steve helped himself. Charles decided to get right to the point. Did you know that Freckles needs a home? He asked, pointing to the happy pup. At the moment, Freckles wasn't playing with a dog who had a thick brown and black coat. Adelaide said you might be interested. Dancing Steve watched the dogs play. Well, if I wanted to have two dogs, I might be, he said. He seems to get along with June. He nodded at the brown and black dog. That's my dog, June. But I've got a busy life, so I'm a one-dog man. He smiled apologetically. Sorry, he said. Keep trying. There are lots of dog lovers here. He pointed over to a couple named Eric and Patty. Eric and Patty pointed to Carl and Tracy. Tracy pointed to Jake. Jake pointed to Danny and Mary. Danny pointed to David. David pointed to Elsa. Nobody wanted a dog. By the time the party was down and the last guest headed up the trail, Charles was tired and discouraged. You okay? Steve asked. And they carried dirty dishes into the cabin. I know you missed Fluffy. Cole had taken the lamb home with her, and Charles already did miss him. He missed watching him jump around. He missed giving him bottles. He even missed changing his diaper. He could tell that Freckles missed his friend too. The white pup lay on the bed near the wood stove, his chin on his paws. Charles shrugged. I do miss Fluffy, but it's not just that. I asked pretty much every one of the guests today whether they like to adopt Freckles, and I still haven't found him a forever home, he said. Steve put down a pile of dishes and wiped his hands on a dish towel. You didn't ask me, he said. Charles stared at him. Because you don't want a dog, he said. I mean, that's what everybody says anyway. It's true, I don't just want a dog. I don't want just any dog, said Steve. But the right dog just happens to come along, a smart dog, a loving dog, a helpful dog. When Freckles heard the words, good dog, he jumped up and trotted over to Steve. He leaned against Steve's leg and gazed up at him, wagging his tail. That's me, I'm a good dog. Steve gazed back at Freckles and scratched the top of the puppy's head. And that's right, he said. You really are a good dog. So, how would you like to be my dog? Charles held his breath for a second. Then he let it out a burst. Really? He asked. That would be. It would be fantastic, said Dad. Are you sure you're ready for the responsibility? Steve smiled. This guy's no trouble at all. He and I are going to be best pals. It's about time this hermit had some company. He ruffled Freckles' ears. What do you say, friend? Freckles licked Steve's hand and thumped his tail. I'm happy to be home at last. And he can go visit Fluffy whenever he wants, Charles said. He couldn't stop smiling as he helped Steve and Dad clean up and he was still smiling as he and Dad headed off down the path for the very last time. Later today, their backpacks heavy with jars of sweet golden brown maple syrup. It was hard to say goodbye to Steve and Freckles, but Charles knew that the spotted pup could not have found a more perfect home. So guys, we just finished that book, Fluffy and Freckles, and guys, I hope you enjoyed that terrific book. And guys, comment down below what presents you got for Christmas, and subscribe, like, and comment on down below. and smash those things I just told you to click. Or never mind, don't click it, smash that.